Before there were empires, before kings carved their names into stone, before even the oldest myths were whispered into the night, there was only silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against the human mind like an invisible weight. Imagine a world where pain could not be explained, where love had no name, where fear could only be shown through trembling hands and desperate eyes. This is where our story begins, not with words, but with the unbearable absence of them. And yet, somehow from that silence, humanity learned to speak. If you're drawn to stories that reveal the hidden truths of our past, stories that make you feel the weight of history in your bones, then stay with me. Because what you're about to hear is not just the story of language, it is the story of survival itself. In the beginning, humans were not so different from the animals they hunted. They moved in small groups, bound not by shared ideas, but by instinct. Hunger, fear, desire, these were their only guides. When danger approached, they did not shout warnings. They screamed. Raw, chaotic noise tore from their throats, echoing through forests and across plains, carrying urgency but little clarity. It was enough to survive, but it was not enough to understand. Imagine trying to explain fire without words, a flickering miracle that burned, warmed, and destroyed. Early humans could point, gesture, mimic the flames with their hands, but the meaning was incomplete. Fire was not just a thing, it was an experience. Without language, experience remained trapped inside the mind, unreachable to others. And so, isolation existed even within the group. Archaeologists believe that long before structured speech, there were gestures. Hands became tools not just for hunting, but for communication. A raised arm could mean danger. A pointed finger could indicate direction. Faces twisted into expressions of anger, fear, or joy. These silent signals formed the first fragile bridge between minds. But gestures had limits. They disappeared in darkness. They failed across distance. Something more was needed. The human throat began to change over thousands of years. Evolution reshaped the vocal tract, lowering the larynx, allowing a greater range of sound. This was not a sudden miracle. It was slow, almost imperceptible. But it gave humans something extraordinary, the ability to produce varied, controlled noises. At first, those sounds meant nothing. Then, gradually, they began to mean everything. Picture a mother calling to her child with a specific sound, repeated again and again, not a scream, not a random cry, but something consistent. The child begins to recognize it, respond to it. A connection forms. A sound becomes a signal. And in that moment, something profound happens. A sound becomes a word. But language did not emerge peacefully. It was forged in struggle. Groups competed for resources. Miscommunication could mean death. A misunderstood warning could lead hunters into danger. A failed signal could separate a child from the safety of the group. Those who communicated better survived longer. Those who did not vanished. Over generations, certain sounds became standardized within groups. Simple vocalizations turned into proto-words. These were not languages as we know them, but they were systems, patterns that carried shared meaning. A specific sound for water, another for danger, another for food. The world began to take shape through sound. Yet even as language grew, it remained fragile. There were no rules, no grammar, no structure. Words shifted, changed, disappeared. Communication was fluid, unstable. What meant safe today might mean nothing tomorrow. And still, humanity push forward. Then came storytelling. Around fires at night, humans began to reenact events, not just pointing or mimicking, but combining sounds with gestures. A hunt became a performance. A memory became something shared. This was revolutionary. It meant that knowledge could survive beyond the moment. The past could now live in the present. Then came storytelling. Around fires at night, humans began to reenact events, not just pointing or mimicking, but combining sounds with gestures. A hunt became a performance. A memory became something shared. This was revolutionary. It meant that knowledge could survive beyond the moment. The past could now live in the present. As tribes grew, so did the complexity of their communication. New sounds were added, meanings became layered. One word could carry multiple ideas depending on tone, context, and expression. Language was no longer just survival. It was identity. To belong to a group was to share its words. Different groups began to drift apart, both physically and linguistically. Isolation created variation. Sounds evolved differently in different regions. What was understood in one valley became foreign in another. The first divisions of language had begun. With division came misunderstanding. Encounters between groups were tense. Without shared language, intentions were unclear. A gesture of peace could be seen as a threat. A warning could be mistaken for aggression. Conflict often followed. And yet, even in conflict, language grew. Humans are relentless adapters. They began to borrow sounds, mimic each other, slowly building bridges across linguistic divides. Trade, alliances, and shared struggles forced communication to evolve further. Language became a tool of connection and control. Power began to take shape through words. Leaders emerged not just through strength, but through their ability to command, persuade, and inspire. A well-spoken individual could unite a group, direct a hunt, or prevent chaos. Speech became authority. Then came the realization that words could deceive. Promises could be broken. Truth could be twisted. Language was no longer purely functional. It was strategic. Humans learned that controlling words meant controlling perception, and with that, language gained a dangerous edge. As societies became more complex, so did their languages. Grammar began to form, not by design, but through repeated patterns. Certain structures felt right. Others faded away. Language started to organize thought itself. It shaped how humans understood the world. Time entered language. Words for past, present, and future emerged. This was a profound shift. Humans were no longer bound to the immediate moment. They could plan, remember, imagine. They could dream. But with the ability to imagine came anxiety. The future could now be feared. Death was no longer just an event. It was an inevitability that could be contemplated, discussed, dreaded. Language gave birth to existential fear. Rituals began to form around words, chants, repeated phrases, early prayers. Humans started to believe that language itself held power beyond the physical world, that words could influence unseen forces. Speech became sacred. The first myths were spoken long before they were written. Stories of creation, gods, and spirits passed from one generation to the next. Language became the vessel of belief, carrying culture across time. Without words, these worlds would vanish. But memory is fragile. Spoken language changes. Details fade, shift, distort. Stories evolve with each telling. Truth becomes blurred, shaped by emotion and perspective. Language preserves, but it also transforms. Eventually, humanity sought permanence. Words carved into stone, etched onto clay tablets, painted on cave walls. Writing was born, not as a replacement for speech, but as its anchor. For the first time, language could defy time itself. Yet writing introduced new power structures. Those who could read and write held knowledge others could not access. Language, once shared freely within groups, became guarded, controlled. Literacy became privilege. Empires rose on the back of language. Laws were written, orders were issued, histories were recorded, often by the victors. Words shaped reality, defining what was remembered and what was forgotten. Language became history's weapon, and still, it continued to evolve. New words, new meanings, new ways of expression. Language adapted to every invention, every discovery, every shift in human existence. It never stood still, but at its core, language remained deeply human. It carried emotion, love, grief, anger, hope. It allowed one person to reach into the mind of another, to share something invisible, yet profoundly real. It was connection made tangible. Even today, thousands of languages exist, each reflecting a unique way of seeing the world. Some are spoken by millions, others by only a handful of people, fading quietly into silence as generations pass. When a language dies, an entire worldview disappears with it. And so, we return to where we began, with silence. But now, silence is different. It is no longer the absence of language, but the space between words, a pause filled with meaning, shaped by everything that came before. Silence, once oppressive, has become expressive. Language was not created in a single moment. It was not gifted by gods or discovered like fire. It was built slowly, painfully, collectively by countless lives, each adding a fragment to the whole. It is humanity's greatest invention, and perhaps its most dangerous, because with language, we do not just describe the world, we define it.